So by this point, we've discussed the logic behind congestion charging. Let's talk about how it looks in practice. So in this chapter, I want to make a distinction between two different types of congestion charging, and then I'll give you an illustration of each kind in practice, going over some of the advantages and disadvantages and showing how well it worked. The main distinction I want to make is between charges that are levied on freeways, which are sometimes called network charges or corridor charges, and charges that are levied on city centers, which are sometimes called cordon charges. And the reason this distinction is important is that these are very different environments, and in particular, they're different with respect to the different types of users and the different types of goals we have of them. And so let's go back to very quickly to this simple graph of the supply and demand equilibrium and the congestion toll that I showed you in a previous chapter. This graph assumes implicitly that the only goal of a road network is to move as many vehicles as possible quickly, right? The only cost listed here is congestion, and the toll gets rid of congestion, and that's perfect. That's probably true for a freeway, and it's a lot less true for a downtown, right? And so the first distinction I want to make is that when we talk about congestion charging, and especially if you look at sort of a textbook diagram or description of congestion charging, what should spring to mind is the freeway network, right? A freeway network lends itself most naturally to this. It lends itself naturally because logistically it's easier to price a freeway. There's relatively few entry points. It's controlled access. In most cities, freeway networks also account for a disproportionate share of the total delay. In other words, the freeways are where most of the congestion is, and even a lot of the surface street congestion is spillover from the freeways. But the most important point, right, is that on a freeway, there are no modal conflicts. A freeway by design doesn't have pedestrians, it doesn't have cyclists, it doesn't have people getting on and off transit vehicles. In that situation, removing congestion and getting speed is less ambiguously good. And that is really not the case for city surface streets. They're intrinsically much more complicated. And so if you think about the downtown of whatever city you're in, it probably has lots of different entry points. It has lots of through traffic. And most important, it has lots of different users, and we want to accommodate those users. It has people who are pedestrians, it has cyclists, it has people getting on and off transit vehicles. And so it is not unambiguously good to make it so that vehicles can move much, much faster through a downtown the way it would be on a freeway, right? On a surface street in a downtown, the goal of reducing congestion and letting cars go faster has to be balanced against the safety and needs of lots of other users in a way that is not the case for freeways. So what this means is there's two different approaches really to congestion charging. One is these network or corridor charges, which would be applied to freeway networks, and the other is what we call cordon charges, which get applied to downtowns. And the cordon charges are, as we just discussed, more complicated. It doesn't mean they're bad, but it does mean they are very different, and it's important to understand that. So let me give you two examples of real-life congestion charging systems, one of which is more like a network charge, and one of which is a cordon charge. And the first one, which is more like a network charge, is in Singapore. And the basic story for people who are not familiar with Singapore is that it's an island city-state of about 5.6 million people. It came a little bit late to sort of economic development. The quick history here is that in the 1970s, as Singapore was growing wealthier, traffic started to get much worse. So what the government initially did was to put a lot of heavy import duties and fees on motor vehicles. So you can see this on the slide, but it had import taxes from 30 to 45% on cars, that registration fee that was 25% of a car's market value. This was later raised to 55%. Despite all these efforts, traffic got worse. And so in 1975, Singapore put in place what became the world's first cordon charge. I know I said in the moment ago that Singapore was a network charge, but they started as a cordon charge. This was the 70s, there wasn't a lot of technology, a very simple program that basically said drivers coming into the central business district of Singapore had to stop and buy a sticker. The price of the sticker was $3, and the logic behind that was nothing other than this was twice the bus fare. And if the car carried over 3 people, the sticker was free. So you got a discount for being a carpooler. One sticker allowed in and out privileges all day. And this was a kind of an old, cumbersome system. Enforcement officers sat in booths. They monitored vehicles to make sure they had a sticker, and they recorded and fined vehicles that did not. So this was, as you can imagine, a very labor-intensive process for both the drivers and the government officials, but it did seem to work pretty well. And in 1989, the fee was actually extended to evening times rather than just during the day. And it did work, right? As crude as it worked. So traffic volume fell about 50%, traffic speeds doubled. You can see the number of cars and taxis traveling through the zone plunge after 1975. So this was very encouraging. But the road network did remain congested. And so Singapore took a number of extra steps. And I'm telling you about these extra steps both to provide some important context for this case study so you understand what was happening around the congestion charge, but also to drive home the point that you can do lots of different things, some of them quite aggressive, and congestion itself can still remain persistent. It's another way of thinking about the fact that really pricing the road is the only thing that really solves this problem. And so in 1987, Singapore began subway service. They did not have it before. And then in 1990, a very extreme program was put in place that actually tried to limit the total growth of vehicles on the island. And so starting in 1990 and continuing today, if you want to operate a vehicle in Singapore, you have to bid for and purchase what's called a Certificate of Entitlement, or a COE. And that COE allows you to use the vehicle for 10 years, at which point you either have to scrap the vehicle or bid for another COE. The bidding happens twice a month. It still does over 3 days. And the price to operate a vehicle is quite expensive. So this is from the most recent, as the time I'm speaking, bid auction. And you can see the different prices to operate a vehicle. And $1 in Singaporean is about 73 cents in the US. So to interpret some of these numbers, if you wanted to operate a Category A vehicle, which is basically like a sedan, you would have to pay the equivalent of about $50,000 in the US. That's not for the car. That's just for the right to operate the car. And so Singapore became a very expensive place just to own and operate a car. And this is a story from The Economist from a few years ago, basically saying that a Singapore family sedan right now, when you account for all the taxes and fees and the certificate of entitlement, costs the same as an average US home, about $150,000. So Singapore became a very expensive place just to own a car. But there was still traffic. And so then the island began electronic road pricing. And Singapore's electronic road pricing system today is probably the closest thing we have. It's not quite the same, but the closest thing we have to a textbook version of congestion pricing. And what I mean by that is that a large portion of the whole network is tolled, and the prices, as I showed you in an earlier chapter, vary depending on when and where you drive. So they really are calibrated to be responsive to demand and calibrated to maintain a certain speed. And the way this works is that there are toll gantries on roads entering downtown and freeways around the downtown. And as you drive under those toll gantries, money is deducted from transponders that each vehicle has. And as I mentioned, the prices vary dramatically. And this has worked. That when it was first put in place, the traffic fell 10 to 15% and speeds rose. And that has continued to be the case. And Singapore is a city that's about as dense as San Francisco. It's a very dense city, but it manages to maintain a road network that doesn't have a lot of congestion. The speeds do range between 45 and 55 kilometers an hour on the freeways because they are priced to do so. So that's a network charge.